Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you, please join me in welcoming him to the podium, Mr. Mike Morris, Chairman of the Board for American Electric Power and a good friend of the Council on World Affairs.
Well, thank you very much. Since retiring from the Chief Executive Officer's role, I don't have a chance to stand at a podium, so I'm only going to be here about 20 minutes. It is an honor for me to be here today to introduce a very dear friend of mine. Ernesto and I have the honor of serving on the board of the Alcoa Aluminum Company, and I must tell you that he is one of the most interesting board members, insightful, obviously internationally aware of the challenges going on in that business worldwide. He also sits on the city board and Procter & Gamble, a great Ohio company, of course, in one of the other big C's, not here in Columbus. We're trying to get him here, but we can't get that worked out. So it really is an honor, but I think most of you know the background. It was already said. Ernesto was the president of our neighbor to the south for a number of years, 1994 through 2000. Before that, he served them in their banking industry and other government assignments for an extended period of time. Secretary of Education, Secretary of Economic Programming and Budget, and ultimately the Undersecretary of Budget. And that would tell you a great deal about how deeply he's been involved in international financial issues for that period of time. Ernesto, since leaving government service, has also done a number of very interesting things. Co-chair of the Partnership of the Americas Commission with Tom Pickering, co-chair of the Commission on Drugs and Democracy with former Presidents Cardoso of Brazil and Garriga of Colombia. Ernesto earned his bachelor's degree at the School of Economics and National Polytechnic Institute in Mexico, his Master's of Arts and his PhD at the Yale University, where he serves currently as the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization, which I think gives you a real window into the treat we were about to experience here as my dear friend Ernesto Zedillo shares with us his views of the world, which he will do freely. Ernesto?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased and thankful for the opportunity to come before this distinguished audience from the vibrant community of Columbus, Ohio. I thank the World Affairs Council of this city for hosting me. I salute with recognition Patrick's modesty, you know, and of course his energetic leadership of this council. I also want to recognize the fine contribution of the Center for Latin American Studies of Ohio State University towards a better understanding of Latin America, not only in this state, at this university, but also in the United States. Very especially, I want to thank my dear friend, very dear friend, Mike Morris, for having kindly enticed me to be part of this event and for having introduced me to you in such a gracious and generous way. Thank you, Mike. Today, I want to speak about the relationship between the United States and Latin America. Essentially, I want to stress that although this relationship is by many economic and social indicators already quite significant, it is still far short of its full potential. I am convinced that both the United States and the Latin American countries would have much to gain from a closer collaboration, not only with a view to intensify our trade and investment links, but also to tackle a number of problems that are challenging our governments and societies, and whose solution, by their very own nature, require collective action rather than purely national and isolated efforts to be solved successfully. Let me affirm that inasmuch as it is not true what some pundits claim, that the US and the Latin American republics tend to be two distant neighbors and overly suspicious of each other, I also submit to you that progress in our endeavors of common interest is more frequently than not excruciatingly slow. When I say this, I have in mind, for example, the plan of action adopted at the very first summit of the Americas, which took place in December of 1994 in Miami, in this country. The document subscribed by all the leaders of our region was, at least on paper, the most ambitious blueprint for continental cooperation that ever existed. Unfortunately, if you look again at that document and check it against reality, you would confirm how modest has been the progress towards fulfillment of the commitments established therein. It is not that what was committed at that first summit of the Americas wasn't really needed. The participant heads of government, and I was one of them, were convinced that the plan of action we adopted was in the national interest of each one of our respective countries. The strong point I want to make is that if in the middle of the 1990s, the adoption of an ambitious agenda for cooperation was fully warranted, the case for it today is even stronger. Given what has happened since the winter of '94, finding in that first summit's plan of action ambitious chapters on topics such as combating the problem of illegal drugs and related crimes, eliminating the threat of national and international terrorism, this is 7 years before 9/11, energy cooperation and constructing the free trade area of the Americas, which was the big announcement at the time, the start of negotiations towards the free trade area of the Americas. When one looks at all of this, one is left with the idea that either, probably more so than anything else, we were very naive, or probably one day they would say that we were very visionary. Who knows? The fact is that the scale of ambition for an effective continental partnership, far from consolidating, has been reduced over time when just the opposite should be happening. It is not only that some of our all common problems have gotten worse, not better, but also that we confront new challenges stemming from the ways in which the global economy and geopolitics, as well as our own domestic conditions, have evolved over the last 2 decades. Our common concerns about security, organized crime, energy, the environment, international financial volatility, and the need for open markets are more, not less significant today than 20 years ago. It is also the case that the, now we know, illusory window of unipolarity that seemed to be wide open back in the 1990s, and that could have made some people in the United States believe that this country did not have much to gain from enhancing its continental partners in order to balance other countries' and regions' power, that window is now totally closed. We are now in a multipolar world in which, given the uncertainty about the way in which the other poles of economic and geopolitical power will evolve in the future, prudence, both by the United States and its continental neighbors, should suggest a bigger effort to come together. But there are not only negative or defensive reasons to pursue this effort. For the United States, a good argument for working closer with its Latin American partners is that, notwithstanding the problems that do remain, the region contains also lots of good news. After overcoming the travails of the 1990s, the region as a whole has achieved its best economic performance in a generation and even managed to emerge largely unscathed from the 2008-09 crisis. Impressive economic, political, and social progress has taken place in many Latin American countries. Over the last 10 years, the Latin American GDP per capita has grown at an annual average rate of 3.5%, having done it at a rate of only 1% on average the previous 20 years. The fundamentals of our economies have improved immensely. It is somehow ironic that as the developed countries, including the United States, struggle to rein in national debts that are approaching or have surpassed, in the case of some European countries, more than 100% of their respective GDPs, fueled by fiscal deficits that have bordered on 2 digits as a percentage of GDP in recent years. The Latin American countries' debt, fiscal and external balances indicators are significantly strong. For example, in 2011, the Latin American countries had on average a national debt of 50% of GDP, accompanied by economic growth that is still dynamic, considering the rather uncertain prospects of the global economy. Long gone are the days when inflation, fiscal irresponsibility, large external deficits, and stagnation differentiated negatively Latin America from other regions in the world. Progress in Latin America has not been just in GDP growth. Significant strides have been made in reducing poverty as well as inequality, and in practically every country, the middle class has grown substantially. Most countries in a region are now considered by the multilateral institutions to be middle income or upper middle income. Even if our economies don't do better than in the last decade, and we have the potential to do much better, according to most long-term projections, not only is Latin America bound to keep its present share of global GDP, which will continue to grow, but its two giants, Brazil and Mexico, rather soon will be among the 10 largest economies in the world. Actually, Brazil is already there. Interestingly, according to those projections, by the middle of the century, not a single European country will be among the 10 largest economies, not even Germany, whereas Brazil and Mexico, along with 7 other now developing countries from Asia and Africa, will make the list, of course, in the good company of the United States. The recent good performance of and fine prospects for Latin America are, of course, excellent news for our country's peoples. But they should also be positive news for the United States at the present juncture, which calls for a significant rebalancing of this country's economy with respect to its partners in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia. Paradoxically, the need for the U.S. to engage more closely with Latin America to rebalance its relationship with the rest of the world happens at a time when, in general, the Latin American countries themselves have diversified their international economic links. The number of significant trading and investment partners of the region are expanding, with China in particular acquiring a prominent role. Latin American exports to China increased 25-fold between 1990 and 2010, while their imports from China grew even faster. China's participation in Brazil's, Chile's, and Peru's trade is now larger than that of the United States, and a close second in Argentina and Colombia. China not only has become a key buyer of Latin American commodities, thus helping to reverse the long-term decline in the region's terms of trade, but is becoming an increasingly important investor in the region. Obviously, our trade and investment diversification is not opposed to an intensified relationship with the United States in areas of mutual benefit and interest. And of course, undertaking such intensification already has a very strong base. The United States exports to Latin America and Caribbean countries 3.5 times as much as it exports to China, and 30% more than it does to the European Union. The US buys about 40% of Latin America's exports and an even higher proportion of its manufactured exports. 1/3 of US global imports of crude oil come from Latin America and the Caribbean. Despite the aforementioned diversification, the US remains the first or second commercial partner for practically every country in Latin America, and it provides almost 40% of foreign investment and practically the totality of the $60 billion in migrant workers' remittances received annually in the region. But the room for further integration is still enormous. The United States needs to grab the opportunity presented by Latin America's expanding markets, attractiveness as an investment destination, and enormous reserves of energy and minerals, among many other important circumstances and reasons. For the Latin American countries, a more intense economic engagement with the United States and its concomitant access to this country's 16+ trillion a year economy, which is more than 3 times the region's total output, as well as its technological and managerial capacity and capital, should also be seen as a very effective leverage to accelerate our growth and continue making progress on the social front. Although it might not be realistic to attempt it for this or the next year, given the political circumstances and also the recession in many economies in the world, the purpose of achieving a free trade area in the Americas should be revived sooner rather than later. Now that the United States has free trade agreements with Mexico, with NAFTA, Chile, Peru, Panama, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, it makes eminent sense to retake the initiative launched in Miami in 1994, to have a free trade area of the Americas. Assuming that the US will be willing for its own interest to recover that initiative, Brazil will be the other key player to commit in order to give the FTAA a good chance of materializing. Achieving that engagement of Brazil should not be as hard as it looked in the past. Brazil, Brazilian leaders, Brazilian private sector are increasingly aware of the importance that access to global markets has for its prosperity and is discovering that partnership more openly with the three North American countries provides enormous opportunities. Not too long ago, Mexico and Brazil announced that they are going to negotiate a free trade agreement. The United States agricultural policy was the main obstacle for this country to pursue seriously the FTAA. But both the current and prospective high prices of agricultural products, as well as budgetary conditions in this country, do open an unusual circumstance to shift that agricultural policy in a direction that could facilitate enhanced US-Brazilian trade cooperation, not only towards the free trade area of the Americas, but also towards the successful conclusion of the WTO Doha round. Unavoidably, both the United States and its Latin American partners must do much better to tackle issues that have become true irritants in their relationship. Chief among them are migration and drug policy. The Latin American countries' need and responsibility is to continue reforming their domestic policies and institutions in order to remove the obstacles that still limit their pace of economic growth and social development. Low productivity, insufficient flexibility in product and labor markets, poor infrastructure, inadequate provision of education and health services, and most importantly, weak rule of law are the impediments to resolve if our countries wish to continue overcoming problems of poverty, inequality, and social exclusion. As this is accomplished, the push factors of emigration from our countries to the United States will continue to be moderated, as is already happening. And we will have also a better capacity to address the drug and organized problems more effectively. But problems like illegal migration and drug-related organized crime will not be properly tackled without some significant adjustments in the United States' own policies. Of course, it is first and foremost up to the American government and people to define this country's immigration policies. What outsiders like myself can stress is what has been observed by very serious American citizens, backed by very serious research, and that is that the US economic and cultural dynamism is explained in no small part by its traditional openness to immigrants, and that looking forward, the US economy would benefit from a new immigration policy that recognizes fully the reality of its labor markets. Those enlightened Americans have proposed that in addition to enhancing border security and enforcing foreign labor laws, the United States should establish a three-part visa system made up of temporary, provisional, and permanent visas to encourage circular migration patterns and eventually provide a path to legal status in the United States for illegal immigrants without a criminal record. Drug policy is another area where a serious review in the United States and the Latin American countries, and in fact in the rest of the world, seems to be warranted. As the Latin American Commission on Drugs and Democracy that Mike mentioned before, and more recently, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, both of which I was a member, concluded that global war on drugs has failed. The enormous expenditures on measures directed at producers, traffickers, and consumers of illegal drugs have clearly failed to effectively reduce supply or consumption, while fueling enormous criminality and violence, particularly in the Latin American countries, not least Mexico, which has suffered an incredible wave of violence that has caused around 50,000 deaths in less than 6 years. In the Global Commission, which included distinguished US statements like George Shultz and Paul Volcker, we submitted that drug policies must be fundamentally redesigned. They need to be based on human rights and public health principles and crafted in a way that erodes massively the revenues obtained up to now by organized crime. It is encouraging that our plea is now being discussed seriously in some parts of Latin America, and that at the recent Summit of the Americas in Colombia, the leaders had a more open dialogue on drug policies. Ladies and gentlemen, as we said in the report of the Partnership for the Americas Commission, which was published in late 2008, we said, historically, the United States and Latin America have rarely developed a genuine and sustained partnership to address regional, let alone global challenges. Some mutual distrust rooted in past historical events is partly to blame. Also, the Latin American and Caribbean countries were often not ready to make stable commitments. The United States had other preoccupations and did not make hemispheric partnership a priority. Problems and solutions were seen from Washington as country-specific and were managed mostly on a country-by-country basis through bilateral channels. Meanwhile, multilateral forums such as the Organization of American States and the summits of hemispheric leaders ran out of steam, became mired in confrontation, or remained under-resourced. Today, however, please let me insist, changes in the region, in our continent, and in the world are making hemispheric partnership not only possible, but I submit to you, also indispensable. The key challenges faced by the United States and the Latin American and Caribbean countries, such as recovering and sustaining economic growth, securing sustainable energy supplies, and combating organized crime and drug trafficking, have become so complex and deeply global that they cannot be managed or overcome by any single country acting alone. The United States needs stronger partners in the Latin American region, and we Latin Americans need a prosperous and engaging United States. We all must commit with a shared sense of responsibility to overcome the challenges and grab the enormous opportunities stemming from an enhanced partnership in the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. I trust that the Columbus Council on World Affairs and the Center for Latin American Studies will continue supporting the construction of that promising partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Zedillo. This is the time for our question and answer period. We have two forms, actually three forms, actually four. You can come to the mic, you can write on a little note here and hold it up and we'll bring it up. Or if you're watching live right now via live stream, you can Facebook or Twitter your question. We're monitoring that right now. And it looks like our cameraman is in front of the mic, so if you don't mind moving, I'd appreciate it. One of the things I bring to your attention is the Global Report, which is the Columbus Council on World Affairs' recent release. And one of the things that it shows us, its purpose is to define and identify an inventory of the global assets and interconnections we have with the world. And Mexico shows up, economics, our immigration, and many other areas. So I'd encourage you to look at that. Let's take our first question from the mic, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President. I'm Jim Rutledge from the law firm of Bricker and Eckler. Thank you for your comments. Your call to action, it occurs to me that it's more likely to be received after the elections in November. What are the major obstacles to action along the points you mentioned, and what do you think the prospects are for movement on those points after the presidential election this November?
Well, I know very little about U.S. politics, but what my friends like Mike Morris inform me, is that American politics in recent years have not become easier than they used to be, but rather more difficult. I mean, it's evident that as economic conditions have deteriorated, not only here, but in many other parts of the world, and political competition intensifies, and some polarizing takes place, it is very hard to come to political agreements, to do things that may not be extremely popular in the short term, but that medium and long term is in the national interest. If we speak about the United States, it's in the national interest in this country. So that's why I submit that you need not only a statesmanship on the part of the executive branch of government, but somehow citizens need to put some pressure on their representatives and senators in Congress to look farther in the horizon and outside the borders to pursue the best interests of the United States. I think it is very important, and that's I think very pertinent to raise the point, to have foral ideas where citizens and representatives of all kinds of sectors come and think and deliberate here, discuss global issues or continental issues or regional issues, and that somehow that eventually gets fed into political process. From outside, sometimes we feel that the U.S., despite being this fantastic powerhouse of the global economy, tends to be too much inward looking, and people tend to ignore how interdependent the others are on the United States and how interdependent the United States is on others to be successful. And I think that has been perhaps a problem in American political culture, to be more proactive in making people and politicians to understand that we live in a more interdependent world, and that is not a bad news. That has been a factor of prosperity and actually of international peace and security. And therefore, that circumstance has to be looked after by the stakeholders, including the United States. So I hope that as we go through this electoral season, which by the way is not only the US, we are having elections in France, we are having elections in Mexico, by the way, in July, and then July. I hope that the next year the dust settles and economic things start to look better, and then probably we will have a more propitious environment to to open or reopen some of these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our next question, if I may invite it, this is from the audience, written question. Can you assess the impact of the improvements to the Panama Canal on the Americas?
Well, I think it has great potential as long as we keep our economies open. I think for the U.S. will be very positive. I used to be director of a railroad company, Union Pacific. Probably it's not a good news for Union Pacific to have but I think it's a great news for the U.S. economy and for global trade. So I think we should be admirers of the vision and the courage of the Panamanian leadership that decided to do that, which is somehow ironic, because for so many years there was this question in this country whether the Panamanians will be capable of managing the canal. And I think there were good reasons to have questions. You look at the history of Panama and the kind of governments that they had at some point. And yet, democracy in Panama has delivered a capable government that has had the vision, and the courage and the technical capacity to put together what is needed to have this great infrastructure that I am told is running on time. So I think it's great news.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Lorena Bravo. As a student in business in Mexico in that time before NAFTA, as a big believer of NAFTA, I would like to know how do you see Mexico nowadays compared to that Mexico when I was a student? Because we all have big dreams for NAFTA. How do you see Mexico compared to what Mexico should be planned at that time?
Well, I think 2 points. One, I think NAFTA has delivered what serious people expected NAFTA to deliver. Probably relative to what some people that tried to oversell NAFTA or thought that just by doing NAFTA we were going to avoid doing other things in our politics, in our economy. Well, those people will be disappointed. But I can assure you that NAFTA has been a massive success for Mexico. Although I insist there are some people who said, Mexico has not solved every problem, Mexico has new problems, and they immediately jump to blame it on NAFTA. And that's ridiculous. I mean, development, it's a very complex undertaking. You cannot develop by just opening up yourself to trade and investment. You need to do a lot of things inside your country to enhance the productivity of your factors of production, to become more competitive, not only because you are an open country, but also because you have flexible product and labor markets. You have to invest more in education, as I mentioned in my remarks, in health, and very importantly, you have to strengthen your institutions, in particularly those charged with delivering rule of law. I think we Mexicans have made progress on some aspects, but we haven't yet made sufficient progress in others. I think we will, and then I think a more balanced and proper assessment of what NAFTA had meant for Mexico's development will be made.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. This one came twice, two different people, so I'll read one of them, but it is obviously...
Where did you read those?
Pardon?
Okay.
If they come by...
Maybe you made them last night. Don't make any difficult, okay?
If the PRI wins the presidency of Mexico in the next elections, what changes, if any, do you expect in the war against the narco gangs?
I'm retired from Mexican politics, so I cannot speak from any political party, not including my own. You should ask the candidate of my party, who I expect he will win, but you should ask him, not me. Next.
Hi, I'm Ron McChesney. I'm a geographer in Columbus, Ohio. And going back to NAFTA, having studied the trade patterns between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, I got interested in the relationship between Canada and Mexico because only 2% of the NAFTA trade was between the two countries. But I was just curious, how would you sort of compare and contrast the economic relationship between Mexico and Canada versus Mexico and the United States?
Well, obviously, the relationship between Mexico and the United States and the relationship between the United States and Canada is more intense than the relationship between Mexico and Canada. We are separated. Pierre Trudeau used to call it the elephant, the American elephant, because he used to say, you know, Pierre Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada, great man, used to say, you know, being neighbor to the United States is like sleeping in a bed with an elephant. That's why I use the term elephant. But actually, the political relationship between Mexico and Canada has become extremely close. We used to be totally absent, you know, from each other. And I think that if you think about two countries in this continent that tend to coordinate on global fora, then you have to think about Mexico and Canada. I'm not so sure that when you handle properly the figures, trade figures, you will not find that our trade, once you take account for all this supply chain complexity, our bilateral trade has not increased. I think it has increased dramatically since NAFTA was enacted. So here again, you know, I think NAFTA has a good report to give about Mexico and Canada. By the way, Canada has a program of circular migration of workers from Mexico in the agricultural sector, which is not huge, but I would say is very well managed and very successful. It could be an example to do something, which, by the way, was copied from an old program that we used to have between Mexico and the United States, and that unfortunately was suspended in the 1960s.
Thank you. Would you allow me to do this one that we went over earlier?
Read it, and then I will decide.
Okay. This question actually comes from the audience. How does the recent nationalization of Spanish companies by Argentina and Bolivia hinder economic development and opportunities for international cooperation in the region?
Well, you know, I think there are two issues. I think every country has the right to manage its resources in the best way for its national development. And I understand that part of the story, but I also know from experience from Mexico and also from my technical work that the state owning that kind of companies is not a guarantee that you are going to maximize the benefit of those resources for your own people. And I can tell you, you know, quite frankly, that's the story in Mexico. We have had monopolies in the oil and electricity sectors, and I'm not convinced at all that an alternative model would not have been better for Mexican development. In fact, I believe that an alternative model now will be better for Mexican development. So I do regret that in some Latin American countries, sometimes rather than walking forward, we walk backwards. I think it eventually will be a very negative experience for these countries. And of course, my Spaniard friends are a little bit disappointed, to say the least, right?
Thank you. Sir.
Dr. Zedillo, good afternoon, nice meeting you. I'm Adolfo Lustono from Cardinal Health. I'm sure you're aware of the book, The President's Club. It's a new book coming from Nancy Gibbs and Mike Duffy. and tax.
No, what book?
The President's Club is basically a description of the previous.
It's not in my reading list. Sorry.
It should be. But,
No.
Well, it's just a kind of a summary. It's a description of the former U.S. presidents' collaboration during the recent and past history, how they have been collaborating and so on. So my question to you is, there is something similar, specifically in Mexico, about former presidents working together for common goals or problems in either recent history or in the past, based on your experience?
Well, I don't know the book, and I don't know what collaborations are described there.
This is for U.S. presidents.
Okay, U.S. presidents. Yeah, probably they speak about President Clinton working with President Bush in Haiti and things like that, which are nice. But no, it's very nice, and the two of them are my dear friends, and I admire when they do those things. Now, in my own case, I had a very ambitious goal when I finished my presidency. And I said, I want to be the perfect former president. And this is an endeavor at which I have full control to achieve it or not to achieve it. And the golden rule to do it is very simple. Don't mess around. Once my political life was over, for good reason, because in Mexico, fortunately, we have no re-election, 6 years, fixed term. And I told my people the day I finish, I'm going from Mexican politics. So given that decision, and so far I have been quite successful in pursuing my objective, I don't mess around with former presidents in my country.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question.
Sometimes they do with me, but I don't pay nothing. They try.
Hi, I'm Brian Marine, student at Ohio State. So the Mexican-American border has some of the most violent cities in the entire world. And unfortunately, a lot of that violence is geared towards women. And many experts blame this on the rise of the maquiladora industry because of the low wages, precarious employment, and upset gender relations. So in your opinion, what can the Mexican and American governments do to stop the violence without destroying the border economies?
Well, I'm not so sure that your causality is right. I think the maquiladora industry is paying those people salaries which are manifold the salaries they would be getting if they had stayed in their poor, remote villages in the south of Mexico. So that is a fact. Second, there are social consequences when these urban agglomerations develop too quickly. You are not able to keep up the pace of providing some essential social services. You will have unintended consequences. But I'm not so sure that admitting that part, that we can trace back this violence to the maquiladora industry or that. I think I dealt with that in my speech when I said we have a very serious drug problem, organized crime problem, that is a common problem, but that unfortunately, at least now, Mexico is paying the worst part of this deal. I like to speak of the bad NAFTA. There is a good NAFTA I just spoke about, and now there is this bad NAFTA where Mexico puts the drugs, either Mexican or Colombian drugs or from other parts of the world, the corruption, because drugs infect your institutions and generate corruption. And very sadly, we also put the death. I mentioned 50,000 people killed in a little bit more of 5 years. And then the United States puts the money to buy the drugs and the weapons that are used to kill the Mexican people. And that is a very bad NAFTA. And the reason for that bad NAFTA is a rather wrong-headed policy on drugs in this country and in the world, because this is not just the United States. This policy was formalized internationally in 1960 in the United Nations, re-emphasized in the early 1970s, actually in 1969, just after the election of President Nixon in this country, and we declared the war on drugs. And we don't want to say that, as other wars in which sometimes we have been involved, this war has failed. And I think as long as we don't recognize that and reconsider these policies, unfortunately, we are going to see these kinds of problems. Mexico may be successful, and I hope it is successful, rather sooner than later, in controlling the problem in our country. That's the good news. The bad news is that the problem, if we don't change the policies, will not be solved for the world at large, because we will push, as we are doing already, the problem to Central America and to the Caribbean and to the Southeast United States. We'll go back to Miami Vice. You were too young to see that TV series. Yeah, but don't laugh, it's true. It's true. And what are we going to say then? We fail again. Well, we have been failing now for half a century. How long more are we going to fail before we recognize that this is the wrong policy?
Thank you. We,
have one more question?
yeah, I was just going to say, Dr. Zedillo told me never turn away a student, and if I may guess, you may be a student. If you're not, I apologize for the insult.
Well, I'm there a student, and thank you very much for your
You
time.
bet.
Thank you, Dr. Zedillo, for your time here today. My name is Antonio Armas. I do share either naive or visionary idea that one day America could become one solid economic potency from Canada to Argentina. Of course, there are many challenges to be solved before that in terms of exchanging policy culture or economic culture or trade culture and so on. You mentioned that immigration is indeed one of the biggest issues that we have to solve first, and you proposed the idea of having a three-part visa system. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that system? Which countries should we involve first? How should you test it? And how come this is gonna help us promote the creation of jobs and exchange between the different countries who will be part of this agreement?
You probably noticed that I was very careful in saying, I don't want to tell this country what its policy should be. What I was doing was to quote, I said, enlighten Americans. And you can find these ideas in documents and proposals that have been produced by Americans. I'm just going to give you one or two sources. Go back to a report that was produced, I guess, 6 years ago with the illustrious membership of people like John McCain and Senator Kennedy, where they propose something like this. And the list could be a very long one. There are very concrete proposals. The economic principle is very simple. This country has a need to balance its labor market, because the structure of the labor market, the needs of this economy have shifted over time. This country, by the way, continues to be the most open country for immigration in the world, which we never say that part of the story. This country accepts 1 million people every year. Well, labor economy, we say, oh, you need to accept 1.5 million, or a little bit less than that now, if you want your labor market to work all right without illegal workers. So why don't you make a system, And if it is circular migration, then better, because then you can avoid other issues that comes with it. But again, this is not my proposal. This is a proposal I endorse, and you can go as a good student. Just use Dr. Google, and you will find my sources.
Thank you for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking you. Join me again in thanking the Columbus Metropolitan Club, Our sponsors, the Ohio State University Center for Latin American Studies, Kegler Brown, and also Mike Morris for helping make today possible. You have a survey in your handouts, and you also have upcoming events from both the Council on World Affairs and the Columbus Metropolitan Club. Thank you again for joining us. We are adjourned.